I welcome you all to the module 1 of this course, and this is the third lecture of module 1. So, today our lecture is titled as Eastern and Western Perspective on Well-being or Overall Positive Psychology. So, we will try to give an overview of how Eastern cultures and Western cultures differ in their perspective on how to conceptualize and understand well-being. So, that will be the idea behind today's lecture. So, before we talk about today's lecture, let me give you a brief recap of the last lecture. So, in lecture 2 we talked about the concept of positive mental health and well-being. So, in that lecture we introduced the concept of well-being and how mental health is conceptualized and how well-being fits into the structure of mental health. We also discussed the concept of hedonism and eudaimonism are the two broad perspectives in order to understand the concept of well-being. We also specifically looked at how psychologists look at each of these school of thought from the psychological perspective, from the literature of positive psychology. So, we discussed psychology of hedonic well-being, which is also called as subjective well-being. We also looked at how psychology looks at eudaimonistic well-being, how it is conceptualized, how it is measured, and which is also technically called as psychological well-being. We also then at the end discussed some of the theories which are from the positive psychology, which discuss well-being by combining both this hedonism and eudaimonism. Two such theories we discussed in the last lecture. One is Key's 13 dimensions of mental health as flourishing. So, that model also combines both hedonic well-being as well as eudaimonistic well-being in order to holistically define well-being. And another model that we talked or discussed in the last lecture is Martin Seligman model of flourish, which is also called as PERMA model, PERMA model, which also combines both hedonic well-being as well as eudaimonistic well-being in the overall conceptualization of well-being. So, these are some of the things that we discussed in the last lecture. Since this is the first module, we are giving introductory concept of the positive psychology. So, today we will be talking about how this concept of well-being, which mostly we talked from the Western perspective in the last lecture, how it differs from the Eastern perspective. So, that will be the idea in today's lecture. So, the main ideas that we will be discussing in today's lecture will include Western views on well-being, which we already discussed in the last lecture. We will just give an overview, and then Eastern views of well-being, how Eastern cultures looks at well-being, and then we will talk about some of the broad parameters on which these two cultures differ in the concept of well-being. Okay, so let us start today's lecture. So, when we talk about Eastern and Western cultures, so we need to understand before we talk about how they conceptualize well-being, it is important to understand the difference between Eastern and Western cultures. Broadly, what is the meaning of these two words that we use? So, when we talk about Eastern culture and Western culture, basically we are talking about some typical geographical regions which differ in the broader perspective of worldviews. So, in the Eastern culture, it includes geographical regions, it includes countries mostly in the Asian countries like China, India, Japan, Korea. Western culture includes countries and continents mostly in the Europe and North America, influenced by mostly European traditions. So, this is in terms of geographical location. Western cultures are located in the mostly European and North American regions. Eastern cultures are located mostly in the Asian continent. Now, in the context of core values, if you see, Eastern cultures are very collectivist in their perspective. They focus more on group harmony and interdependence of people in the society and the group. So, if you look at Eastern cultures, most of the countries that we mentioned under Eastern cultures, Asian countries, broadly, these are like broad ideas. Broadly, they focus on collectivist aspects of living, where focus is given more on collective aspects, how people live in the society as a group. Importance of group norms and other things are given a lot of importance. Group harmony is given a lot of importance. How the interdependence of each other in the society and the group is given a lot of importance. On the other hand, the core values of Western culture are very individualistic. They are mostly focusing on innovation and personal freedom. So, Western cultures are broadly, they are more considered individualistic perspective is given more importance. So, they focus more on their own achievement, own personal life rather than the focus on the group aspect is given less. social aspect, group aspect, community aspect is given less importance as compared to individual life and individualism. Personal freedom, those things are given more importance in the Western cultural context. Now, these worldviews are typically governed by a lot of religious ideas, because Western cultures mostly follow Christianity. Eastern culture follows religions such as Buddhism, Confucianism, Hinduism, Taoism and so on. So, most of these cultural worldviews are influenced by those religious worldviews also. So, this is broadly how Eastern culture differ from Western cultures. Now, let us understand, when we talk about these differences are not absolute. That does not mean everybody in those culture will be like this. These are like general framework to understand these regions, because the culturally as a group, most of the people are influenced by these worldviews. That does not mean everybody in those culture will be having these kind of worldviews. So, these are like broader perspective, not the absolute differences, but more general framework to understand these cultural differences. So, this is something we need to keep in our mind in order to understand these things. So, these are like broad group level perspective that we look at, not individually there may be differences in the people also. Now, Western conceptualization of mental well-being or well-being, we have last lecture was specifically devoted on the concept of Western concept of well-being. So, when we talk about Western views on well-being, it mostly focused on two broad views of well-being, which is discussed elaborately in the last lecture, that is hedonic and eudaimonistic well-being. So, that was the main, both these aspects are found in the Western concepts. So, let us see, just to give you overview, very broad overview of these two concepts of well-being, which are mostly studied in the Western cultural context. So, the concept of hedonic well-being basically focuses on the concept of happiness, pleasures and basically avoiding negative emotions. So, that is the idea of hedonic well-being. Eudaimonistic well-being is mostly focused on the broader aspects of meaning and purpose in life, self-actualization, self-realization, growth in life, those aspects. So, the hedonic well-being mostly focuses on maximizing pleasures, minimizing pain from life. So, the life with maximum pleasure, minimum pain is considered more towards hedonic well-being. Hedonic well-being is also technically in the positive psychology, it is called as subjective well-being, where it is in the layman term, it is conceptualized as happiness. So, that subjective well-being or happiness, these are the terms that are used under the tradition of hedonic well-being. On the other hand, eudaimonistic well-being focuses on achieving personal growth, fulfillment, living in accordance with the one's true nature. These are mostly emphasis given on meaning, virtues, flourishing of life and so on. And if you see hedonic well-being, focus is more given on short term perspectives, like focuses on immediate emotional experiences, immediate pleasures of life and so on. Eudaimonistic well-being focuses on long term perspectives, such as focusing on enduring personal development and purpose. So, it could be a long term project in one's life and so on. Key components by which these concepts are measured include hedonic well-being is measured in terms of positive emotion, life satisfaction, enjoyment in life and so on. Eudaimonistic well-being is measured using concepts such as autonomy in life, mastery in life, personal growth, contributing to something greater than oneself or one's life. So, some bigger projects and meanings and missions of life and so on. Those things are basically contributing to the concept of eudaimonistic well-being. Philosophically, they also came from two different schools of thought. Mostly hedonic well-being, the proponent of hedonic well-being include Aristippus, Epicurus and so on. Eudaimonistic well-being was mostly favored by people like Aristotle, Plato and so on. Examples of hedonic well-being includes feelings of joy from eating a favorite meal or enjoying a relaxing vacation and so on, that will come under hedonic well-being. Under eudaimonistic well-being, things will include like feeling fulfilled from achieving a lifelong goal or helping others and so on. So, these two perspectives are theoretically they are very different, conceptually they are different. Hedonic well-being is mostly focused on positive emotions and pleasures of life. Eudaimonistic well-being said that is not enough to conceptualize well-being of life, because these are very transitory things, they keep changing. In order to conceptualize well-being, we need to focus on long-term broader perspectives, which gives a stability in life, enhances functioning in life. So, things like personal growth, achievement, meaning in life, those kind of things are given importance under eudaimonic well-being. Now, Western cultures mostly studies well-being using both the perspectives. More specifically, they focus on hedonic well-being. So, these things were elaborately discussed in the last lecture. So, the key differences we have already discussed. If you see the contemporary Western theories of happiness and optimal functioning also emphasize individualistic virtues such as self-determination, autonomy, self-esteem, mastery and control. So, even under the eudaimonistic well-being, the focus is more on individualistic things like having autonomy or personal freedom in one's life, having higher self-esteem, mastery in life, control in life and so on. So, there even conceptualization of eudaimonistic well-being is also from the very individualistic perspective, and hedonic well-being is something obviously given a lot of emphasis in the Western culture in terms of understanding well-being and so on. Now, so this Western aspects we have already looked in detail in the last lecture. So, we will not discuss too much into those research. Today, our focus will be more on Eastern views of well-being and how it differs from the Western perspective. So, that difference, what are the parameters on which it differs, and how Eastern views or Eastern cultures or Asian cultures looks at well-being, and how those thoughts are shaped by different religious traditions and so on. So, let us look at the Eastern views of mental well-being. So, if you look at the Eastern views on well-being, it are deeply rooted on spiritual traditions, they are deeply rooted in holistic spiritual and collectivist philosophies that emphasize balance, harmony and interconnectedness of people. In most of this culture, the focus is given more on holistic understanding of well-being, not just transitory temporary emotions, but holistically how to look at life and what contributes to well-being, the spiritual aspects of life, the collectivist aspects of life and so on. All these things are included in the Eastern perspectives. So, in many Eastern traditions such as Buddhism, Confucianism, Hinduism and Taoism, well-being is not simply the pursuit of pleasures or individual happiness, but the cultivation of inner peace, mindfulness and acceptance of life impermanence. So, a lot of this spiritual and religious tradition contributed to those understanding, and if you look at a lot of these Eastern religious traditions or spiritual traditions, they focus on happiness as more than just individual pleasures or individual happiness, but more of how to cultivate inner peace, how to cultivate the disciplines or the mental disciplines of mindfulness, accepting life impermanence or transitory nature and look beyond that. So, those are given a lot of importance in the Eastern perspectives. Now, in terms of realizing those aspects, the focus is given on meditation, yoga, mindfulness are seen as paths to achieve those states of equilibrium or tranquility. Now, since the goal is to reach the inner peace, acceptance of life. Now, how do you achieve those goals is through things like meditation, yoga, prayer, mindfulness and those things are given a lot of importance in the Eastern cultures. Now, in the Eastern culture, well-being is often derived from fulfilling one's role within the family and society. So, that collectivist aspect is given a lot of importance. Now, your well-being in life or happiness in your life is not just your individual pursuit, but how do you pursue your role in the family, in the society and the larger society, and maintain harmonious relationships and contribute to greater good of the community. So, that collectivist aspect is defines your sense of well-being. So, that is a very sharp difference between Eastern and Western perspective. So, the emphasis in the Eastern tradition is of interdependence and interconnectedness, where one's well-being is intricately linked to the well-being of others. So, people are not just focusing on pursuing their own well-being, the focus is also given on pursuing the well-being of people around us. So, there is a sense of interconnectedness among all people. So, as a group, as a community, one has to grow. So, the focus is not on individual achievement much in terms of autonomy. Eastern philosophies promote humility, compassion, dissolution of the ego as essential for fulfilling and meaningful life. So, a lot of importance in a lot of these spiritual traditions are also given on dissolution of ego or sense of separate individual and just focusing on yourself. That is something not given much importance, because spiritually this is considered as an hindrance in terms of achieving peace in life and so on. So, the Eastern religious traditions like Buddhism, Confucianism, Hinduism, Taoism offer diverse perspective on well-being. Although there are broad common themes, but they are also very different in terms of finer nuances of understanding, which emphasizes mostly on spiritual growth, balance and interconnectedness of individuals. So, that is the summary of how they look at well-being from the Eastern perspective. Now, to understand Eastern perspective, let me give you very brief summary of some of this religious tradition and how they look at well-being, because the concept of well-being are basically shaped or colored by these understandings. So, mostly the religions which influences our sense of well-being in the Eastern tradition, one is Buddhism. So, in Buddhism, the key concept is to liberation from suffering. So, the basic idea in Buddhism is achieving nirvana state, which basically means is a state free from all suffering. So, that is the goal all Buddhists aim to achieve. So, well-being is connected to that idea. So, the well-being is closely tied to the concept of liberation from suffering, which is achieved through mindfulness, ethical living and development of wisdom. So, this concept of liberation from suffering, obviously it needs lifelong practice and training of mind and body, living ethical life, developing wisdom, developing mental practice and stability and so on. All these things are given importance to achieve that goal. So, the goal is to reach nirvana state, which is free from suffering. These are the pathways by which it can be achieved. So, Buddhism focuses on 4 noble truths, which basically focuses on that life is suffering, and the second noble truth talks about there is a cause of suffering. Third says, there is a way out of this suffering, and the fourth one says the way out of suffering is eightfold path. So, they talked about different 8 steps or important aspects which you can follow to come out of this suffering. So, this is called as an eightfold path. So, I will not go into details of all these things, because that is not the focus of this lecture, but that is the idea that there are noble truths, universal truths of human existence, and one of that life is full of suffering, and there is a cause for suffering, and there is a way out of that suffering, and the way out they specifically specified in terms of eightfold paths, how to go out of that. So, the central to this practice of mindfulness, it includes focusing on meditation techniques like mindfulness or vipassana, which foster self-awareness, help individuals observe the thoughts and emotions without attachment and so on. So, that is the practice part of it, which requires a lot of training and so on. So, by practicing this non-attachment, compassion, loving kindness, individual cultivate inner peace and ultimately reach nirvana or enlightenment state, which is free from suffering, and that is the ultimate state of well-being according to this perspective. So, a lot of these ideas in the countries that follow Buddhism is shaped by this Buddhist perspective. The next is Confucianism. A lot of Eastern cultures are also shaped by Confucianism thoughts. So, what is the major philosophy behind this thing, Confucianism? So, key concept in the Confucianism philosophy is basically it mostly focuses on social harmony and ethical living. So, that is the major focus, that how to achieve social harmony, group harmony in the society, and how to live an ethical life or virtuous life, moral life and so on. So, this Confucianism emphasizes the importance of social harmony, moral development, fulfilling one's role within society and so on. So, this is very collectivist concept. Here the well-being is not viewed as an individual pursuit, but as something achieved through fulfilling social obligations, cultivating virtues such as benevolence, which I think in Chinese term they call is Ren, righteousness, propriety and wisdom, and maintaining harmonious relationship within family and community. So, this is how some of the central idea behind Confucianism thought processes, that it is not just an individual pursuit well-being, but it is something achieved through fulfilling social obligations, cultivating virtues, benevolence, righteousness, propriety, wisdom and so on, maintaining harmonious relationship. So, these are some of the major concepts of Confucianism thought. They also have concept of Zunzi, which means a true gentleman, which serves as an ideal representation of a person who embodies moral excellence and contributes positively to society. So, that is the kind of prototype of a gentleman. So, that is the idea of Confucianism. So, Confucianism teaches that well-being is attained when individuals align their actions with roles and responsibilities, promoting greater good and social harmony. So, this typical concept of collectivist idea which defines Eastern cultures is very much the core of Confucianism thought processes. So, this thought process is also kind of shapes Eastern culture, a lot of countries that follows this tradition. Taoism is another philosophy or spiritual tradition that also shapes thought processes of Eastern culture. Taoism basically talks about how to live a harmonious life with nature. Nature includes with other people as well as the nature part of every aspect of nature, how to live harmoniously. So, that is the idea behind Taoist philosophy. In Taoism, well-being is achieved through living in harmony with natural flows of life, which is called as Tao. Tao basically means natural flow of life, and practicing the principles of we or effortless action. So, when somebody is in flow with the nature, they are not fighting or resisting whatever is happening in their life. So, then they are in the natural flow of life, and then action happens very effortlessly. You do not have to put too much of effort and pressure on this. Things automatically spontaneously flows out of you, because you are in tune with the nature. So, that is the basic idea of Taoism. So, Taoists believe that forcing things against the natural course, if you keep forcing things which are not likely to happen because these are not in tune with the natural tendencies of yourself, then it will create imbalance and stress in life. So, stress is an outcome when you are not in tune with the natural flow of life, or you are like forcing something, then the stress and imbalance happens. So, whereas aligning with the natural rhythm of the universe brings peace and fulfillment. So, that is the idea behind Taoism, how to live peacefully aligned with the nature, not forcing things too much from your own egoistic perspective. So, that is the idea. This concept of balance is further emphasized through yin-yang principle, which means both masculine and feminine aspects balancing is also important. How to balance opposite aspects of life, masculinity, femininity, light and dark, activity, rest. One has to make balance in all the opposites. So, that is the principles of yin and yang. So, that is given a lot of importance in Taoism. Taoism encourages simplicity, detachment from material desires, and acceptance of one's life changes and cycle as a way of cultivating tranquility in well-being. So, Taoism gives a lot of importance in the acceptance of things. Whatever happens, it is happening because of there is a will in the nature that it is happening. If you do not resist, you will feel peaceful and happy if you accept whatever changes are happening. So, acceptance is at the core of Taoism. Taoism includes a lot of practices like meditation, breathing exercises, nature immersions, go to the nature and reflecting on the nature immersions are commonly practiced to help individual connect to the Tao or the natural flow of life and achieve state of greater well-being. So, this philosophy also influences a lot of Eastern ideas. The last one we will be talking about, the major religion that shapes Eastern thought processes is Hinduism, primarily practiced in country like India. Hinduism has varieties of ideas in the context of well-being. It includes things like dharma, spiritual growth, unity with the divine. That is also another ultimate goal of life, how to achieve unity with the divine, which is also called as a moksha. Now, Hinduism is a very multifaceted religion. It has so many diverse views encapsulated within the same religion, and it has diverse views on well-being. It emphasizes both spiritual and material aspects. So, Hinduism does not deny the material aspects of life, it also embraces that, it also embraces spiritual aspects of life. So, it is a very multidimensional religion in that sense. So, the concept of dharma, which some people translate it as a moral duty, some translate it as a more general sense of natural rhythm of life is also called as a dharma. It is a central idea, it guides individual to live righteously according to their roles and stage of life. By following dharma, individuals contribute to social harmony and personal fulfillment. So, whatever moral obligations, duties you have, so that is also given a lot of importance to achieve well-being in one's life. So, Hindu philosophy also highlights 4 major aims of life, that every human beings should fulfill those aims in their life. It includes, one is dharma, so whatever duty you have, whatever natural course of action you need to take according to the roles and responsibilities, one has to follow that. Artha, which means material success. So, once there is, once you achieve, certain stage of life, then one need to pursue material success in life to achieve well-being also. Kama, which means pleasure. So, it is not denying that you should avoid pleasures in life, it is also embraced, that is also part of one's well-being of life. And last one is moksha, which means liberation. At the end of, within all this, or at the end of that, whatever other aspects of life, one needs to search for liberation, which means transcending all these aspects of life, or whatever the life that is acting as a foundation, or it's binding people within this realm of life. And it has many philosophies how to achieve that and so on. Diverse aspects are there. So, we cannot go into the details of all these things. So, the true well-being is ultimately found in moksha. That is the ultimate aim. Other things are also important in life, but that is the ultimate moksha. The liberation from cycles of birth and rebirth, which is achieved through self-realization and union with the divine. So, that is the ultimate thing. Other things are important, but moksha is ultimate, because once you achieve that, there is nothing more to be done. You are free from all kinds of suffering, cycles of sufferings of birth and rebirth and so on. Because you achieve an union, there is no need to again take birth as a separate individuals and so on. So, that is the ultimate thing. So, well-beings are looked from all these lenses also from the Hindu perspective. So, it also includes practices such as yoga, meditation, devotion. All these aspects are included to achieve those goals. So, these are some major religions in the Eastern cultures that shapes the worldviews, and which forms the foundation of this thought process of Eastern cultures and how well-being is thought of. Now, we will see some of the major parameters on which Eastern and Westerns are different. Now, we have broadly talked about what are the major aspects of well-being in the Western cultures, and we explain broadly how Eastern cultures looks at well-being. Now, we will look at more specifically the different parameters on which they actually differ. They come from those broad understanding only, but we will look at more specific differences, how they look at worldviews and how they look at well-being also. So, we will see how Eastern and Western culture differs in Eudaimonism and Hedonism concept, because we have discussed these two traditions in the Western perspective. We will see whether Eastern perspective, how it looks at these two perspectives also, and how it is different from Western perspective. We will also look at how Eastern and Western culture differs in self-transcendence versus self-enhancement. One culture focuses on self-enhancement, another on self-transcendence. We will see how they differ. We will also look at how focus on harmony and mastery differs in these two cultures. We will also look at contentment and life satisfaction, how these two are also different in these cultures. We will also look at valuing and avoiding suffering. What is the role of suffering in the concept of well-being in both the cultures? And we will last look at the role of spirituality and religion in conceptualization of well-being in both the cultures. So, these are the things, some of the parameters that we will be discussing in today's lecture, in order to understand the finer differences in the concept of well-being in both Eastern and Western cultures. Now, just to give a note on this, that these differences, whatever we will be discussing, are primary from the theoretical philosophical viewpoint. In reality, these differences are not absolute, but exist on a spectrum with variations within the cultures. So, these cultures are also not absolute, like Western cultures are very absolutely like this, or Eastern, so things are also fluid. But broadly, these are philosophically, theoretically, this is how differences are conceptualized in different cultures. But these are not absolute in terms of, when we look at people in those cultures, there are spectrums of differences may also be available. So, let us look at some of these differences and how they look at Eastern and Western cultures. The first one is Eudaimonism versus Hedonism, how Eastern and Western culture differs in these two aspects. We have already seen that Western cultures studies both the aspects, hedonism as well as Eudaimonism, but if you see the major focus what is given in Western culture is Eudaimonism or subjective well-being, which is based on hedonic understanding of well-being. So, Western culture, if you see the output of research and the number of people working in those areas, hedonic tradition is given much more importance than eudaimonistic concept in conceptualization of well-being. So, subjective well-being or hedonic well-being scales measures presence of positive emotion, life satisfaction, absence of negative feelings over time. This is how measurement perspective, this is how it is conceptualized. So, this hedonistic approach aligns with Western cultural values such as liberal modernity, hedonism, romantic individualism. So, hedonism perspective aligns very well with the Western worldviews. So, therefore, most of the research actually are aligned towards subjective well-being or hedonic well-being is from the Western perspective. So, happiness in the contemporary West is predominantly defined in the presence of pleasures and emotions. Okay. So, typically happiness is studied using emotions and pleasures in the Western perspective or Western cultures. Most, if you see large scale multinational studies on mental well-being led by Western researchers recently, they utilize mostly hedonic framework relying on subjective well-being measures. So, that shows which aspect of well-being is given emphasis. So, hedonic well-being generally is given much more emphasis in the Western cultures. Now, if you look at Eastern traditions in terms of hedonism and eudaimonism, this particular aspect, generally Eastern perspective or culture do not favor hedonism as an aspect of well-being, does not give much importance. This may play some role, but Eastern culture they do not give too much emphasis on this aspect, or pursuing only emotional aspect of well-being. In the Eastern cultures, positive emotions and pleasures are seen as temporary and insufficient to measure true happiness. So, because these are very transitory and they keep changing, so they cannot be used as a true measures of well-being. So, that is the idea in Eastern concept. For instance, if you see the countries or people who follow Buddhism, they reject hedonism, viewing it as a potential path through self-centeredness. In the religion like Buddhism, they do not give much importance on the hedonic aspects of well-being, because they say it is too much self-centered and it will not lead to long-term well-being and so on. Similarly, some traditions which follow Sufism and other things in terms of in some countries in the Eastern cultures, although Sufism is not typically but in some country it may be there, it is not typically followed, but still the philosophy of Sufism and other thing also it gives lot of importance on asceticism and kind of avoid denying hedonic aspects. Most of the religions in the Eastern cultures focuses on that. So, hedonism does not play much important role in the worldview of Eastern cultures in terms of well-being. Eastern philosophy mostly views bodily pleasures with suspicion, and it promote techniques for controlling lot and avoiding prioritizing pleasures over essential virtues. So, virtues of life is given more importance than seeking pleasures in life. And then suffering is also not very negatively seen in the Eastern cultures. It is views negatively mostly in the hedonistic perspective. In the Western cultures are not very similarly translates in the Eastern cultures. Suffering is not dismissed as it is mostly dismissed in the Western cultures, because their sufferings are also seen as a requirement for spiritual growth. So, they also plays very important role. So, as a result, hedonism may not be suitable for defining happiness in the Eastern cultures, where emphasis is on virtues and foundation of good life. So, they may not really define the Eastern worldviews if you look at hedonic aspects of well-being. Western view are very typically hedonistic, perspective gives a lot of importance. So, this aligns with eudaimonistic understanding of happiness. Now, if you look at eudaimonistic aspects, probably some of the eudaimonistic understanding aligns more with the Eastern perspective than the Western perspective. Although in the Western perspective, some people also studies eudaimonistic perspective, but then how this eudaimonistic perspective is looked at Eastern and Western culture may also differ. So, the question comes, can we apply Western eudaimonism that we discussed in the last lecture, can be applied in the Eastern context? Now, the Eastern concept of happiness is fundamentally eudaimonistic. If you look at conceptually, it is not at all hedonistic. So, can we apply then Western eudaimonistic models and measures on Eastern context? Now, the research in the conceptual analysis, it shows that the concept of eudaimonistic well-being in the Western perspective may not exactly translate into Eastern perspective. Let us see how that is the case. First, Eastern Eudaimonists focuses on selflessness, adaptation to the environment and relational virtues, while contemporary Western psychology emphasizing autonomy, mastery over one's environment, even in the eudaimonistic perspective. So, the eudaimonistic perspective broadly, Eastern perspective may fall into that, but still how specific parameters or indicators of eudaimonistic well-being may differ in both the cultures. So, even in Eastern eudaimonistic concept, the focus is on selflessness, dissolution of ego, how to adapt to the environment rather than mastery over the environment. So, a Western perspective of eudaimonism focuses on mastery over the environment. So, that is something, even in that aspects also they may differ in terms of expression. In non-Western cultures, even individualistic virtues are directed towards achieving self-transcendence, caring for others, contributing to the collective. So, that expression of eudaimonistic aspects or parameters may also differ, even though broadly Eastern perspective follows eudaimonistic concepts. Second important aspect how eudaimonistic concept may differ in the Eastern and Western is that certain Western virtues such as autonomy and maintaining clear personal boundaries are viewed negatively in the East. Although this is eudaimonistic perspective from the Western point of view, this is not kind of subscribed by Eastern perspective, focusing too much of individual autonomy and making too much of one's clear boundaries are not looked at very positively in the Eastern culture in terms of well-being, where they are sometimes seen as a source of unhappiness if you are too much focusing on maintaining personal autonomy and so on. So, that is another aspects of difference. So, conversely, if you see Eastern values like experiencing unity with others or sense of no self, which are often valued, may be perceived as pathological in the Western cultures. Like the concept of no self, which is at the core of a lot of this spiritual tradition, how to dissolve your own sense of individual ego is not really given from the Western perspective. This is not seen as a very healthy thing from the Western psychological perspective. So, few things in the Western culture may be looked negatively in the Eastern culture, the few concepts in the Eastern culture may be looked at negatively by the Western cultures, even within the eudaimonistic tradition or indicators of eudaimonistic traditions. Another important thing, for example, filial piety, or basically which means respect, obedience and care for one's parents and elders. So, this is a very important tradition in Eastern cultures. We generally give lot of respect, we also show obedience to our elders or parents and take care of them. So, this is something is a very significant aspect of Eastern culture. It is an important virtue in the Eastern cultures and it is a sign of maturity in the Eastern cultures. If you see in the Western cultures, such concept or social expectation can be seen as a constraint that hinder individual potential and self-expression. So, such concepts are not given much importance in the Western cultures, where people live in their own individual worldviews and so on. So, that relational aspects is kind of downplayed there. So, this is how in terms of expression they may differ. Second important concept or parameter on which Eastern and Western culture differ is the concept of self-transcendence versus self-enhancement. So, if you look at these two concepts, one is basically how self is defined, how the concept of self as a me, as a person, how it is defined in both the cultures. So, in the Eastern culture, the concept of self is again rooted in very individualistic sense of autonomy, my personal freedom, what is about me, those sense of independence, self-esteem, how to increase your own self-esteem, strong ego in a sense of how to kind of maintain a boundary of yourself. These are all essentials of good life in the Western perspective. This is how self is defined. So, self-enhancement is given more importance in the Western cultures. If you look at Eastern tradition, the views are very different, kind of opposite. Here views the self as a small part of the collective and cosmos, often downplaying individual identity. Most of the Eastern cultural or religious tradition, they do not give too much of importance of egoistic sense of self, where you focus too much on your own self, because you are a very small part of this whole vast nature or cosmos. So, too much of glorifying that is not kind of given importance, because that holistic view your place may be very small. For example, Buddhism considers the individual self as an illusion. So, a lot of Buddhist philosophy looks at individual sense as a sense of illusion, means it's a very transitory thing, which is mostly constructed by the mind only. Your sense of self changes when you feel very good about yourself, and on the other hand your sense of self may change when you feel bad about yourself or something bad happens in your life. So, this may be very mentally constructed thing, and overall may be an illusion. While Confucianism emphasize the relational self, how you define self in relationship with other people in the society and community, maturing by prioritizing family and group over personal desires. So, if you see these Eastern cultures, the sense of self is defined very differently. Self-transcendence is given more importance rather than self-enhancement. So, Hinduism, Sufism also encourages dissolution of individuality. The key to happiness is to, if you can remove your sense of ego, the more and more proportionately happiness and sense of well-being enhances, which is not how Western sense of well-being looks at. So, fundamental difference has significant implication for defining well-being and positive. So, this whole definition is sense of self is different. So, how do you define well-being from the perspective of self in both the cultures will be very different, and their implications will be very different. So, if you look at Western models and measurement tools which emphasizes self-determination, autonomy, breaking free from societal conventions, lot of individualistic concepts, they often neglect social aspects of well-being, focusing on individualistic trait. So, Western models are defined mostly from this perspective based on their core values. So, this quality may not be accurate indicators of well-being. So, if you use all these Western indicators in the Eastern cultures, they may not accurately reflect the belief system of people or the worldviews of the people, which a lot of research actually does that. They just take Western models and use them in the Eastern cultures and takes the scores and analyze them. So, in a lot of this Eastern context, such analysis may not reflect the actual views of the people. So, in the Eastern aspects, self-transcendence is a very important aspect of psychological maturity. A less selfish approach to happiness promotes compassion, empathy, respect, which are considered sign of maturity and well-being in the Eastern tradition. So, this worldview needs to be looked at while measuring well-being in different cultures. So, those cultural worldviews should be taken into consideration when we want to study well-being in different cultures. So, the model should be defined from those cultural worldviews also, not just only automatically or blindly taking Western models into the Eastern cultures that may not actually reflect the true meaning. The third one is these two cultures also differ in the emphasis on harmony and mastery, which a little bit of it we have discussed in the earlier point also, that Eastern culture focuses more on harmonious relationship with other people in the community and group, focus is given more on that. Mastery on the other hand, how to master environment, how to master or control things, and those things are given more importance in the Western cultures. So, let us see some of these aspects. So, humans are mostly seen as privileged beings who are more intelligent and has the authority to dominate and control the aspects of nature in the Western perspective. So, since in the Western perspective thinks that human beings are most intelligent and they have the authority to dominate nature. So, a lot of these activities are also reflected like that. So, that is the major views from the Western perspective. So, this is coming from the Enlightenment thinking in the European traditions, which views raw nature as something to be controlled and subdued. Consequently, humans are expected to analyze, label, categorize, manipulate, control and consume the world's resources. So, that sense of mastery over things, controlling things is very much inbuilt in the Western thought processes. In contrast, Eastern worldviews are very different. Humanity is considered as a very small integral part of cosmos. There is no separation of humans from the nature, because we are all part of one cosmos and everybody is dependent on the other. Nature, human beings, all are dependent on each other. So, it is not like one has to control the others. So, there is a sense of oneness with nature. For instance, Hinduism views humans as a part of nature with no inherent superiority over the other entities. Only forms differs, So, Eastern views do not look at human beings as like most superior things as compared to other aspects of nature. There is a sense of unity with all the aspects of nature, and all are dependent on each other. So, if one starts controlling and having mastery over others, there can be an imbalance, and that is what is we look at in the actuality in the world also. So, the Eastern concept is more of harmonious nature, how to build harmony with the nature and emphasize oneness with the nature rather than having mastery over the nature. So, Eastern philosophy often perceive all beings, humans, animals, plants and even non-sentient entities as interconnected part of one whole. So, this cosmos is one thing, one consciousness, and everything are like part of that. So, no one is superior than other, everything is part of one thing. So, it is not like one has to superior from others and control other things. Unlike many Western schools of thought, Eastern tradition do not draw a sharp distinction between humanity and rest of the creation, and concept like mastering, conquering nature are not very aligned with the concept of Eastern traditions. It does not fit with this whole worldview. When you think everything, you are one with everything, then mastering and controlling does not arise, that sense does not arise. So, this fundamental difference between Eastern and Western perspective has an significant impact on how do you define these positive qualities and well-being. Okay. So, in alignment with the Western views on humanity's relationship with the environment, Western perspectives defines well-being in terms of environmental mastery, control are highly valued. This emphasis is evident in contemporary Western concepts of good life. Like Riff's model of well-being, eudaimonistic well-being that we discussed in the last lecture, it includes things like the one aspect of fully functioning person is described as someone who has a sense of mastery and competence in managing the environment, controls as complex array of external activities, makes effective use of surrounding opportunities, and is able to choose or create context suitable for personal needs and values. So, this is one of the important parameters of eudaimonistic well-being in the Western perspective, which if you see given a lot of importance on control and mastery over the environment and so on, which may not fit into the Eastern perspective. So, in the Eastern, on contrast, they prioritize interpersonal harmony, adjustment, where well-being is achieved through mutual sympathy, harmony and so on. So, the value of self-transcendence, interdependence, flexibility and all these things are given importance here. So, current Western models and measurements of well-being are primarily based on mastery-oriented approach, which often overlooks the importance of harmony emphasized in the non-Western context. So, this is another very specific difference. The fourth one is contentment versus satisfaction. Now, which one is applicable to which? Let us see. So, if you look at content, these two terms may look very similar, but they are different. In the Eastern cultures, contentment is given very importance, Western cultures satisfaction is given more importance. So, let us see how these two things are different. So, in the Western literature, life satisfaction is an important part of well-being, mental health over the past 4 decades. In subjective well-being theory, satisfaction is considered as a core component of mental well-being. So, if you are more satisfied with your life, you are considered more towards well-being in terms of hedonic well-being. So, your life is more, will have more well-being, hedonic well-being or subjective well-being if you are more satisfied with your life. So, that is a very important component of well-being in the measurement of subjective well-being in the Western tradition. Eastern tradition, rather than using life satisfaction, the contentment word is used to emphasize for well-being. So, contentment actually differs from satisfaction. How it is different? So, while in the East concept of contentment on superficial level may look very similar, contentment and satisfaction, but they may differ. So, in the East, contentment includes satisfaction along with other qualities. So, contentment is satisfaction plus some other aspects, like it is a delicate balance between joy and sorrow maintained through both happy and difficult times. So, if you are able to maintain a balance between joys and sorrow, then it is contentment, So, if you are content when you are able to accept both success and failure, joys and sorrows of your life, then that is contentment. It is not just satisfaction with something in life, Contentment comes from the acceptance of opposite spectrums of life. So, that is called contentment, and Eastern tradition gives more importance to contentment as an indicator of well-being as compared to just satisfaction. So, some other example include in Hinduism, for example, contentment is not viewed as a passive acceptance. So, here it is not just you cannot do anything, so I accept everything. So, it is not that passive kind of acceptance, rather it is described as an intensely dynamic acceptance of results of one's efforts in moment to moment struggle of life. When you cannot do anything, you are just passively accepting, so that is not contentment. You are doing everything and then things may sometimes come out positive, sometimes may come out negative, but you are actively involved in the process. So, that is contentment. So, this acceptance involves facing failure or suffering with composure, dignity and gracefulness, and is believed to stem from realizations of transcendent self. It comes from spiritual maturity. Contentment comes from spiritual maturity and practices. So, that is something is very much more broader term than just satisfaction with the life, and it is given more importance in the Eastern cultures. Now, concept of contentment in the East is spiritually significant, because all the spiritual tradition gives importance to the sense of contentment, which involve deep sense of peace with oneself, others and cosmos. So, it comes from harmonious relationship with others and the cosmos, then people automatically the outcome is contentment. So, in these traditions, contentment is not influenced by goal achievement, social comparison or amount of suffering one endures. It may not depend on any of these things, that when you achieve goal you feel more content. Even if when you are not able to achieve goals, contentment may be a state of mind. So, in contrast, Western psychology specifically focus on subjective well-being, where life satisfaction is given more importance. Life satisfaction is often treated as a goal in itself. Furthermore, the subjective well-being framework, satisfaction is considered as a desirable state of mind regardless of the underlying causes. So, it comes from basically satisfaction is considered as a goal. So, you have to do something in life so that you are more satisfied with your life. When you achieve that goal, you will be satisfied. So, that is goal oriented approach. So, when you achieve that satisfaction, it is linked to something in your life. So, your life goes out in a positive way, you will be satisfied with your life. So, it is more oriented towards those approach, Satisfaction comes from obviously some positive things in life. You will feel less satisfied when something goes wrong, but contentment may not include like that. Contentment include achieving that sense of contentment even in the both the aspects. So, the source of life satisfaction such as desire, gratification, social comparisons, pleasures are typically not emphasized in long term as long as satisfaction is achieved. So, satisfaction itself is considered as a goal. How you are achieving those satisfaction, that is not given much importance. So, concept wise that may be different. So, Eastern culture focuses on contentment, Western culture focuses more on satisfaction as a concept related to well-being. The fifth one is to what extent this culture focuses on avoiding suffering in terms of well-being. So, in the Western tradition, hedonistic approach by definition it wants to avoid suffering, negative emotions. So, that is included in the definition itself. It emphasizes how to maximize pleasures and happiness in life and avoid sufferings and negative things in life, negative emotions. So, suffering is not obviously it is not welcomed in the Western tradition, and it is seen as things to be avoided in the hedonistic traditions. This perspective can make it challenging to accept hardships, negative emotions, sufferings or unhappiness as a part of broader fulfilled life. So, because you are asked to avoid them. So, by definition these things are not welcomed in life. So, in hedonic psychology the absence of subjective well-being is considered negative, and researchers often overlook potentially positive aspect when someone reports feeling unhappy. So, if you feel less happy or you have more suffering, so from the Western model you will have less well-being, which may not be true in the Eastern sense. From the Eastern perspective, subjective well-being model, which partly defines happiness as the absence of negative emotion in the Western sense, appears unrealistic from the Eastern perspective, because hardship, suffering are unavoidable aspects of life. Eastern eudaimonistic theories accept that negative emotions and anhedonia can coexist in a truly happy life. So, one may have a very happy life, meaningful life, which may be very high in terms of Eastern concept of well-being, but at the same time the person may also experience negative emotions or some little sense of sadness or depression also. That is very much possible that both can coexist. So, these are like not exclusively considered. For example, in Taoism, rejecting unhappiness alongside happiness is thought to lead to suffering. So, if you reject suffering, automatically when it comes it will create more suffering because you are not accepting that. So, rejection leads to more suffering actually. So, acceptance leads to more happiness. Similarly, Buddhist psychology suggests that happiness and unhappiness are interdependent and cannot exist independently. They are two sides of the same coin, you cannot avoid them. So, both has to be considered. So, such views are not very prevalent in the Western concept. In the Eastern tradition, a certain degree of suffering is often viewed as essential for happy life, because that makes you more mature, it helps you to grow in life. So, state of well-being is achieved more in a long-term sense when you suffer and struggle with your life and you become more wise, more mature after facing hardships and difficulties in life. Okay. So, that is something very much ingrained in the idea of Eastern traditions. This is emphasized in most of the religions. In Hinduism, Confucianism also emphasize adhering to virtues even if they come at hedonic cost or suffering. So, if you focus on your virtues and important duties, even suffering may come, but that will give you happiness. So, Buddhism also says enduring suffering allows individuals to purge consequences of past actions, past bad actions. If you suffer more, that means a lot of these past bad actions, whatever consequences they have on your system, they will remove. So, in a sense it purifies you. So, these things are also included in these ideas. So, suffering is not avoided, focus is not on avoidance, but acceptance and kind of flourishing through those suffering. So, overall non-Western traditions or Eastern cultures tend to recognize positive aspects of negative emotions more as compared to Western traditions, where suffering, hardships are generally considered things to be avoided. So, this perspective has significant implication on the conceptualization of mental well-being. For instance, individuals from Eastern background who experience negative emotions over a month might score very low on contemporary subjective well-being scales, yet they may still find genuine happiness in their life and during that time due to spiritual and existential reason. So, if you just follow Western models and use them in the Eastern cultures, again it may lead to erroneous judgment, where a person may be experiencing negative emotions, but overall his sense of happiness and meaning in life may be very good, but that person may score very low in the subjective well-being score if you just follow those Western traditions. So, contemporary subjective well-being measures fall short of capturing this nuanced understanding of well-being from the Eastern perspective. So, that is something needs to be focused on in the research. In contrast, Western psychological Eudaimonism is more accommodative of unhappiness and suffering. If you see Eudainomic perspective, it is still much more accommodating of sufferings and unhappiness, although it is not given much importance in the Western culture, but some aspect of this is also studied in the Western factor. So, at least however, in this theoretical openness has not fully translated into dominant Eudaimoc model in the Western cultures. Although it is more open to suffering Eudaimoc models, but still it is not that played central role in the Western cultures. The last one is about the relevance of spirituality and religion. Then this is something I think we have been talking in this from the beginning of this lecture, that spirituality, religion plays much more role in the Eastern perspective in terms of defining well-being as compared to Western perspective. So, the role of religion plays much more important role. So, if you see in the Eastern tradition, you cannot avoid spirituality, religion when we talk about well-being. You cannot capture the sense of well-being. Dominant Western research often prioritizes materialistic values and moral pluralism. Religion and spirituality are typically examined as a predictor of mental well-being. So, if you see the well-being literature in the Western cultures, they look at how religious beliefs influences well-being, like they are looked at or taken as a predictor of well-being. So, they are not included in the definition of well-being. So, that is how it is different. They use spirituality or religion as a variable which can influence well-being. So, it is like a separate thing in the Western models. So, in the Western models, happiness often assume that happiness and satisfaction should be found within this worldview life, but in the Eastern tradition, spirituality and religions and their understanding of experience of life are very much intertwined in the definition of well-being. For this culture, happiness is often rooted in religious or metaphysical perspective, where transcendence, spirituality, mystical experiences, adherence to religious duties and participation in religious rituals are essential component of their happiness. So, well-being and happiness are integrated within the religious and spiritual concepts. So, this is not like separate aspect that has to be looked at in the religion. So, it is more integrated in the definition of well-being itself in the Eastern tradition. This emphasis of mystical experiences and transcending everyday existence, this state of no self or unity of God is regarded as an ideal. So, religion kind of defines well-being, lot of the spiritual and religious tradition in the Eastern cultures. So, that is another major difference. So, this a lot of this mystical and transcendental experience may not fit with the Western conceptualization of materialism, positivism, rationalism, and they may dismiss a lot of these ideas of the Eastern cultures. Consequently, Western clinicians may interpret many mystical states as a pathological, or they may not understand this because it is considered important or as a sign of well-being in the Eastern cultures, but from Western culture they may look at it as a pathological thing, a lot of these mystical experiences. So, again those are cultural differences. So, in summary, examine religion or spirituality merely as predictor of happiness in Eastern cultures may be insufficient. If you just look at it as a separate thing that influences well-being, in Eastern culture this may not fit much, this idea may not be very suitable. Instead, happiness should be conceptualized and assessed through a religious and morally informed lenses. That is something is more tuned towards Eastern tradition. In these cultures, not all positive emotions or achievement are regarded as component of happiness, they must also be morally justified. Sirf only studying positive emotions may not be good enough, but whether they are morally justified or not, that has also been important connotation in the Eastern traditions. So, these are some of the things. Now, let us come to the conclusions, whatever we have discussed. How can we make, what kind of major takeaways from this lecture? Now, while we have seen there are significant differences between Western and Eastern concepts of happiness and well-being, we have seen there are many differences on each culture focuses on different aspects and mostly opposite spectrum. It is crucial to recognize that both approaches such as harmony and mastery exist within all cultures. Now, a lot of these approaches can exist in both the cultures also, even though broadly they may differ. Individuals in any culture may adopt values from both the poles. So, if you look at individuals, you may find varieties of individuals. Individuals in the Western cultures are more, maybe there are many people in the Western cultures who are more tuned or follow the lifestyles which are more in tune with Eastern cultures, and vice versa. People in the Eastern culture, there may be many people who are more towards aligned with the Western cultural concepts. So, individually there may be a lot of differences. People from all the poles and spectrum can found in every cultures. For instance, a qualitative study by Dept in 2000 and colleagues found that some Western participants associate happiness with inner harmony, even though inner harmony is more towards Eastern cultures, but a lot of Western people actually look at inner harmony maybe as a part of their culture, as a part of their concept of happiness. Additionally, research by Mongilnar and colleague suggests that older Americans are increasingly linking happiness to peacefulness, aligning with Eastern perspective. So, that is very much possible. A lot of people within each cultures may be oriented towards a lot of diverse spectrums. So, however, still notable differences can be found between Western and Eastern cultures regarding the opportunities for these qualities to manifest, and these distinctions remain despite globalization. Even though there may be individual differences, but broadly if you see as a culture, still there are differences if you look at as a group how this all these differences will manifest differently in the different cultures. So, this distinction will still remain even though there is a globalization happening, it still remains, and obviously it is more fluid and it may become less and less difference as the time passes. Now, certain qualities are universally recognized as essential to happiness in both the cultures, with many qualitative studies indicate that, for example, success of interpersonal relationship plays significant role in how happiness is understood across both Western and Eastern cultures. For example, some aspects are given importance in both the cultures, like importance of relationship, or the relationship with other people can play a very important role. But research shows this positive relationship, which is important part of well-being, is a key component of well-being, is also emphasized in Western eudaimonistic models such as Reef's model. However, what aspect of relationship is given importance can also differ in culture, manifestation of that. How these psychological qualities can manifest differently in Western and non-Western context. Some studies were conducted in this direction. For example, one study shows that South African participants highlight familial relationship as vital to happiness, while German participants focused on selecting friends based on personal character, reflecting German's more individualistic culture. So, even though the relationship plays important role in both the cultures or different countries, but what aspect of relationship is given importance may differ in certain countries and cultures. For example, here South African participant focused on familial relationship more than other aspect, while German participant focused on selecting friends, or their relationship aspect was given more importance. So, lot of these things actually similar studies shows, even though one particular aspect like positive relationship with other play important role in both Eastern and Western cultures, but how it manifests could also differ in the cultures. So, this example illustrates that abstract qualities important for a good life can vary in express cultures. So, therefore, more nuanced models and measurements are necessary to account for both the similarities and differences in cultural interpretation. So, what is the need of the hour is that in order to study empirically or research perspective, to understand cultural aspect needs to be given very important, importance has to be given in order to conceptualize models and measurements aspect, so that the proper measurement can be done from the cultural perspective, so that we do not impose just Western models on other cultures. So, these are some of the indicators which shows that how cultures can differ in terms of conceptualization, and that has to be integrated in the measurement of the models. So, these are some of the important things about how Eastern and Western cultures differ in terms of conceptualization of well-being or positive psychological dimensions. So, with this I stop here. Thank you.